just to give everyone a minute before we get started, but thanks for joining. All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. The number's still rising, but you know, we'll start with the introduction. So good morning, or it's not good morning, sorry, I had good afternoon, good evening, good morning in the US. Thanks for joining the 2020 Real Estate Assessment Live Q&A session. So yeah, thanks for everyone for joining. We're excited to walk you through some of the 2021 changes, as well as, you know, from COVID implications to resilience integration, as well as, you know, several members of the real estate team joining me today. So like I mentioned, we'll have a quick introduction of those who have joined us on the call today from the GRESB team. We'll go through some of the updates, a reminder about all of the various assessment resources that we provide to you that are, you know, very helpful throughout the reporting period, and then we'll open it up to a live Q&A session. In this morning's session that we had with Asia Pacific was actually, you know, very interactive. We had over 50 questions submitted. So we have taken some of the really relevant questions and can answer those on this call as that may be helpful to, you know, have the benefit of the good questions from this morning. So with that, I think we can move to the introductions. Oh, well, first, a bit of, I guess, housekeeping. So within Zoom, we have both the chat and Q&A function. For today's call, we very much recommend using the Q&A function so that we can, you know, indicate whether we'll respond to the question live on the call or directly to you. Great, so those that are on the call today. So my name's Kevin Kirby. I've been with GRESB now, June will be 2 years. I've been on the real estate team as an associate, but I'm in the process of transitioning over to the new member relations team at GRESB. So the member relations team is really here to serve our existing members, so both participants, partners, and investors. And so myself and Stephen Pringle, who previously was the director of EMEA, will be joining the member relations team from the real estate side. And we will also have Katie Graneman from the infrastructure side supporting member relations as well. So Charles, maybe you can introduce yourself now. Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for the ones for the Americas. My name is Charles Van Tier. I'm the real estate director at GRESB, which makes me responsible for all real estate products, which obviously starts with the real estate assessments. I'll be kicking off this Q&A session by addressing the impact of COVID-19 on the assessment this year. But before that, I'd like to mention that we also have Stephen Pringles on the call, who is Director Member Relations, so the same team as Kevin. So if you have any question that relates to sales or anything that requires a commercial input, feel free to raise it up because we should be able to address it as well. And finally, we also have Roxana Isayu on the line, GRESB Chief Sustainability Officer. And Roxana was very much involved in the recent change of governance structure of the company. So if you do have questions on that, also please feel free to raise it. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be attending this session with you. I'm looking at the participation rate going to 200 plus, so it's going very strong. So really nice to see, and I'm looking forward to reading your questions and answering them, of course. Eric, over to you.
Great, thanks, Charles. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Landry. I'm the climate change specialist at GRESB. I've been with GRESB for just over a year now. And so I'm responsible for the content within our research products and partnerships that have to do with climate-related risk, resilience, and our carbon accounting methodologies. And today I will be mainly focusing on the integration of the resilience module into the real estate assessment to provide a little context on our journey throughout the three-year module Lifecycle and the decisions that have led to the form and the shape in which we integrate it into the core assessments. So with that, I will pass it on to Christina.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're all well. My name is Christina Baska, and I'm an analyst on the real estate team at GRESB. In my role, I support the development and implementation of the assessment and all things real estate. And I'm looking forward to answering some questions. Over to you, Max.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. My name is Max Merwald. I'm also an analyst on the real estate team. I'm with GRESB now for 1 year, so a little bit less senior than Christina, but I'm already behind me like one entire circle of GRESB. Therefore, I'm happy to help you with your questions as well today. Back to you, Kevin.
Great. Yeah, thanks, team, for the introductions. So with that, I think we can move into something that I'm sure everyone is very interested on the line about, and probably one of the reasons you've joined. So Charles, walk us through some of the implications of COVID, if any, on the real estate assessment.
Happy to. Thanks, Kevin. So obviously a very question that we get on a very recurring basis, recurringly. How did COVID-19 impact the assessments? And to answer that, I think it's worth providing the audience with a little bit of a background as to how GRESB in general approaches assessment development. So as a quick reminder, GRESB has 4 benchmark committees covering 4 regions of the globe, and an advisory board mainly composed of large institutional investors. And on a yearly basis, actually 4 times a year, we do engage with those groups on topics mainly on assessment development. So this year, at the end of 2020 and early 2021, one of the most discussed topic as part of this assessment development review with those governance groups was, of course, the impact of COVID-19 and how we could potentially make amendments in the assessment to cater for the impact of COVID on consumption and emission profiles across the globe. I think the main 2 takeaways from those discussions that we had with those groups was the first one: whether you look at sectors or countries, you will always find very wide discrepancies in how COVID has impacted consumption profiles on real estate assets. If you take, for example, office assets or retail assets, you would obviously expect a consumption decrease because office assets have had to close their doors due to COVID, but not exactly at the same time, since they were very much impacted by country level local regulations. If you take the example of retail, you also expect a decrease in consumption, but again, it very much depends on what kind of retail we're talking about, because some retail have been allowed to stay longer than others, depending on what they're providing. Now, if you look at residential, then actually the opposite trend is expected. You would expect an increase in consumption since most people have had to stay home the last 12 months, a little bit more than 12 months now. So, and these trends actually, very much differ depending on what country and regions you're looking at. So I think the conclusion of that first point was, well, there is no simple or straightforward way to account for COVID on consumption profiles in general. The second point was, for the recurring participants on the line, you will remember that in 2020, the real estate assessment was subject to a lot of developments, both in terms of structure and content. We did restructure the assessment from one list of indicators to components, respectively management, performance, and development. Scoring weights have been heavily impacted, heavily changed. Scoring methodologies as well, new content have been added, which led to somewhat an inconsistency in the output. And if you do remember from the last year benchmark report, this is actually why we calculated a theoretical score last year to provide participants with consistency, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the key understanding that we got out from those discussions is the markets in 2021, covering the 2020 reporting year, required as much stability as possible, which is why, based on those two main takeaways, the conclusion was to remain, to leave the real estate assessment as is, so unchanged in 2021 compared to last year, with the exception of the integration of the resilience module that Eric will cover in a moment. Maybe a last comment to mention is that although the inputs and the scoring methodology remain unchanged this year, for the ones who are a bit familiar with how the assessment works, you will also recognize that our asset portal, so the module on our portal through which you will report your asset level information, does contain something that we call the GRESB outlier model, detection model, which picks up outliers values that are potentially not necessarily wrong, but that could require review from the participants. And these values are picked up based on their intrinsic absolute values. And we do apply outlier model checks on consumption changes over time. And I think what's key to keep in mind here is that since we haven't changed anything in the assessment, those thresholds determining what is deemed an outlier or not also remain unchanged. Those thresholds last year were ranging between 20 and 30%, which means that if, as a participant, you have a consumption change or an emission change by more than, let's say, 30%, you will be prompted to provide a reason for supporting that outlier value. Again, it doesn't mean the value is wrong. It just means that we just haven't changed those values. But what we do intend to do after the submission period, so about mid-July, end of July, we will conduct an analysis on how actually those 2020 consumption and emission data points have been reported across the board for all property types, all sectors, and all countries. And we will loosen these outlier thresholds if necessary. And the reason why we do that is that we obviously want to make sure that a data point that is actual, that reflects actual performance, that is genuine, but as deemed outlier as per the previously defined outlier threshold are included in the benchmark. So if we realize there is a cluster of points are about minus 50% consumption, for example, then we will have to relax those thresholds to make sure that the benchmark do reflect and do include those values. Final comments. I want to emphasize once more that loosening those outlier thresholds will not impact your assessment, because only the hard outliers will impact your assessment. So there will be no direct impact on your submissions. It will only impact the value that we use for calculating the benchmark to provide you with meaningful and insightful benchmark values this year. I hope it was clear. If you have anything that needs further clarification, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to clarify on this. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Charles, for the clarifications on that. It's very helpful. And I would also just like to call attention that in Appendix 1 of the 2021 reference guide, we really detail a lot of what is on this slide that can be used for your own understanding. So Appendix 1 is a good resource for you to reference some of these changes that are here on this slide. And in terms of some of the actual changes that we had for the 2021 real estate assessment, I'm going to turn that over to Eric Landry to walk us through the resilience module integration.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So what I'm going to try and do today is essentially provide a bit of a narrative and some context to how we went about thinking about integrating the resilience module into the core assessments. So as you may know, over the past 3 years, we've offered the resilience module as an optional set of indicators to fill out in addition to the core assessments. And so the idea being that over the course of these 3 years, we could kind of hone in on the most insightful and most useful data, so we could incorporate those indicators into core assessment at the end. So in 2021, those will be incorporated, and we can see what those look like here. But before we get into too much detail, there's a couple of things that we wanted to kind of hold in high regard as we went through this process. The first is assessment stability, as Charles had said. We wanted to kind of minimize the number of indicators that we'd be integrating and so reduce the kind of overall extra reporting burden that our participants would have to go through. And then also keeping the style of those indicators very much the same as what's already been seen in the previous resilience modules, as well as the indicator structure of the rest of the assessment. So it follows a lot of the same kind of checkbox and style user experience that we're very used to. Secondly, over the course of 3 years, we've been kind of aligning closer and closer to the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and their recommendations. And with this final iteration and inclusion into the assessment, not only do we address each of the 4 pillars of the TCFD, but also each of the 11 recommended disclosures that are spread out across those 4 pillars. So very happy with the kind of coverage and alignment with this newest integration. 2 points on kind of the scope of what we're going to carry over is that instead of resilience in general, that could include kind of geopolitical risk, cybersecurity, asteroids, anything really. Instead, we're going to focus that down to climate-related risk. This was one of the main drivers of the kind of inception of the resilience module in the first place. And so, and then of course, with the alignment with the TCFD, that's a scoping decision that would make actually the insights that come out of these indicators much more useful to the audiences looking at the outputs. And then secondly, in terms of social risk, as it was in the resilience module, the indicators relating to social risk will not be carried over into the core assessment. This is not because social factors are not important in building resilience, but the kind of category of social risk ended up being a little bit confusing since it became a catch-all for anything that didn't fall into the well-defined categories of transition and physical risk as addressed in the TCFD. So really it's garbage in, garbage out. There wasn't a kind of a well regarded framework with that was able to kind of capture the broadness of something as expensive as social risk. And so there's actually a lot of overlap with indicators that we already have in the core assessment with relation to social factors. So that is a scoping decision that we've made. It's important to note that these 5 new indicators that will make their way into the assessment will not be scored in 2021. Of course, the intention is to score them in later years, but seeing as in the 2020 resilience module got about 34% of real estate participants overall, that leaves 2/3 that haven't really seen the resilience module indicators at all before. So to kind of smooth that transition, these 5 indicators will not be scored in the 2021 assessment and will not affect your GRESB score. So we can see that in the management component, we have the aspects here, and in the risk management aspect, we will have these new 5 indicators: resilience strategy, transition risk identification, transition risk impact assessment, and the same for physical risk. So physical risk identification and physical risk impact assessment. All of this and more can be found in not only the training videos that we've put together, where we go over kind of walkthrough of how to answer each of these indicators, but also over the course of this week, we will be releasing a series of insights posts on the GRESB website that address the integration of resilience and the 2020 module results. And that has been a collaborative effort with Arup. And so that will also provide some context as to our decisions and our thinking around what resilience means to asset managers and investors. That was a lot, and so I hope you've used that time wisely to think up some good questions, and I'll hand it back over to Kevin.
Great. Thanks, Eric, for the walkthrough. Looking at the next slide, this is just a reminder of the process to actually submit the questions to us. So I see that a couple have come in already that we'll go ahead and answer live. But prior to going to that, and as people are beginning to type their questions and submit them to us, I'd just like it to walk us through some of the assessment resources that we have available to you. So a good resource, an easy one that is immediate access to the reference guide and scoring document is documents.gresb.com. It's an easier way to access the reference guide compared to going through gresb.com/resources. And the documents includes both real estate infrastructure, public disclosure, various assessments. And then some other resources that we have in addition to the reference guide and scoring document. We have a really nice indicator summary. So this indicator summary is like a 3-page PDF that shows you all of the indicators within the real estate assessment, their points associated, the percentage within the GRESB score, whether they're manually validated, as well as whether the assessment is pre-filled, or sorry, the indicator is pre-filled. So this is a nice document for quick reference. We also have the assessment in Excel, which is basically just taking the assessment portal and showing you what the assessment looks like in an offline version. We have the asset spreadsheet, of course, and in addition, we have the scoring simulator, which allows you to predict what you may, or put values into what you think you may score with certain indicators and give you an indication of how you could perform. Obviously, that is limited when it comes to the dynamically benchmarked indicators, but it still is it's a good resource to get a high level understanding of where you sit. In addition, we have our online GRESB training platform. So this is something we launched last year. There are plenty of videos that are really good to get an introduction to GRESB for new participants. Everything from just general real estate assessment to specific components, how the asset portal works in terms of outliers and flags and warnings. So it's a great resource for everyone to use. We also have a video that walks you through resilience integration, which I think would be helpful for those on the line to kind of reiterate what Eric just said. And then I think a good thing to note here is that the real estate training platform does have a separate login from the GRESB user portal. So just, yeah, I think it's worth calling attention to that. And then lastly, we have the GRESB contact form. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but this is just a form that you submit to us. It comes to our help desk platform, and we typically respond within 24 to 48 hours. So if you're looking for a quick response on anything from functionality in the portal to more technical questions on how to report anything within the GRESB assessments, this is your go-to to get a quick response. It's also worth noting here that within the help desk platform, we can route the tickets that are submitted to various individuals who may be subject matter experts. So it's always good to submit it here, and then we can route it more efficiently and quickly to the person best suited to respond to that. With that, I think we can go ahead and get started with some of the pre-submitted questions to us. So we did allow some participants to, not some, everyone had the opportunity to submit questions to us in advance. And these were the most relevant that we think we'll answer on the line. And then prior to jumping in here, I would like to also note that some of the questions submitted to us were very specific. And in those cases, we would like to respond directly to you rather than have them in front of everyone. In addition, as you're writing questions in the Q&A function, again, if the question is too specific, it does not necessarily make sense for us to address that on the line. And so we just encourage you to use the GRESB contact form. So it's best to be anonymous about it and make sure that it's applicable to everyone. Yeah, so with that, Christina will be answering the first question, but I can read it aloud real quick. So all the questions within the real estate assessment refer to the entity. Is it allowed to include policies in the assessment that are in place at the parent company level and then apply to the entity, but it's not specific, not explicitly stated? So Christina, how would we respond to this?
Thank you, Kevin. Short answer is yes. Policies that are implemented at the parent company or fund manager level can be reported as applicable to the entity. The reason why we format the questions in such ways to ensure that all of the documents that are uploaded are referred to the entity and are applicable to the entity and its operations, but the evidence in itself does not necessarily has to be issued at the entity level. With this, it's also important to know that we need to make sure that this is the case while validating. So for this reason, you can use either the GRESB evidence cover page or the open text box that comes together with each evidence that you upload to explain what exactly is the relationship between either the parent company, fund or fund manager, and what exactly makes the evidence applicable to the entity. I saw also a question in the Q&A that I think we can answer together with this one, which was whether a child company can report on properties if the parent company is reporting on the same properties. And the question is that if the child company is a fund and it's an individual legal entity, then all of the underlying assets under this portfolio can be reported separately, even if the group is reporting on the same assets at the same time. Make sure to just use the evidence for indicator R1.1, which defines the portfolio reporting boundaries, and the open text box that comes with it, just so that you can make sure that the relationship and the portfolio boundaries are clearly defined.
Great. Yeah, I think that's very important, is just to make sure that as much as possible, it's clarified through the PDFs and within the evidence open text box that the policies are applicable. It's always better to be on the safe side. So yeah, thanks Christina for that. With the next question, how should we treat tenant and community engagement events that happen annually but didn't happen during COVID for our reporting purposes? So Christina, I think this is you as well.
Yes, thank you. So within the tenants and community aspect of the assessment, majority of the questions actually do not refer to specific events that have happened during the reporting year, but more so whether there are programs and policies in place that stimulate tenant and community engagement. So if those programs have been in place during the reporting year, even if the events in itself have not occurred, then this should not make the questions invalid or not applicable to the reporting year.
Perfect. Thanks, Christina. The next question, what are the criteria for a development project?
Yeah,
this is you, Max?
This is mine, exactly. Thanks, Karen. For development projects, we have two different categories. One hand are actually new construction sites, and the other side are major renovations. New constructions is everything that is from like actually complete new building or actually additions to already existing buildings. And for major renovations, we have also two criteria where we say it's major renovation, which would be either that the alterations of a building affect 50% or more of the floor area of an asset, or if 50% or more of the tenants are actually need to be relocated due to major renovation.
Great, thanks. And with this, I think I can add a bit of additional context here. So for any development projects, these are reported through the development component, but they are using the asset spreadsheet to report them. So for example, if you have a development project that was completed during the reporting year, let's say in June of 2020, this means that within the asset spreadsheet, you would, it's a new construction project. You mark it as a new construction project, but then you mark it as new construction completed. And then from the time the asset is completed up until the end of the reporting year, you would be expected to be reporting the respective performance metrics for that development project. So yes, I think that's helpful context as well. With that, I think I'm going to turn to the some of the questions submitted online, because I do see that Charles, you're queued up to answer a few of these. So first, let's go with the question from Antonio. So I'll read this aloud for everyone on the line. Can you please clarify if the new estimation technique allowing up to 20% estimation applies at entity level based on square meters, or at individual asset level, meaning that each asset needs to have at least 80% of the available data, even though they may be tiny retail units, making a very small percentage. So Charles?
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a really good question, and of course it relates to one of the changes this year. I mean, one of the changes that you will see in the Appendix 1. By the way, Antonio, we're still working on this as part of the final release. If any potential change in this appendix, will be communicating through very clearly through a news item in the assessment portal. But my response will be based on what is currently in the reference guide, written in the reference guide. So to answer your question, the rule doesn't apply at the entity level. It doesn't apply at the asset level either. It actually applies at the utility type per area type level. So it's at the most granular level you can find in the asset level spreadsheet. And which means that you cannot extrapolate nor estimate consumption or emission value based on different areas. I believe that answered the question. There was a second part of the question, if I'm not mistaken. The done in retail units in ground floor making up a small percentage. I mean, again, if it takes up a very small percentage of the floor area, it's really up to it's really up to the percentage, the 20% estimation that really kicks in that case. Shall I go
Thanks,
to
Charles.
the
Yeah, let's go to the one from Winston.
Great. Winston, great question again, and very much related to what we talked about earlier on COVID. So does the outlier model take the tenancy vacancy rate into account in the calculations? So our outlier model did take that into account in the past. It still does. And if you actually look at the guidance from the structure tab of the GRESB asset spreadsheet, you will actually see that we value more the actual vacancy rate than the financial vacancy rate. So in case you do not have the actual occupancy rate or vacancy rate, you can of course report the financial vacancy rate. But remember that we do use those ratios when normalizing intensities for flagging outliers. We're not using that in scoring nor in benchmarking, but just for flagging outliers to make sure that abnormal values are being reviewed by participants. But so the outlier model has not changed compared to last year and still takes those values into account. Actually, when you get into the outlier page of the asset portal, you will see at the very top there is an explanation that kind of outlines the main information that we do use when calculating those intensity values.
Perfect. Thanks, Charles, for that. So the next question I'll actually take, and so this is from Laura Atkinson. It's on the asset spreadsheet, assessment spreadsheet, building certifications tab. How do you include a certification not currently listed in the dropdown, such as BREEAM Offices 2006 or BREEAM Bespoke? So in this case, we do have a process to recognize certifications that are not part of the dropdown menu. So the certification evaluation form is found in Appendix 5C, as well as within the reference guide, you'll see some of the detailed information under the building certifications aspect on how to submit that. So we do allow additional schemes to be submitted through the reporting period. We do have a cutoff date this year of supplying those, which I believe is June 1st. So that and we'll only be doing one rollout of additional certifications added to the asset spreadsheet. But in this specific case with BREEAM Offices 2006 or BREEAM Bespoke, this is a really good question. We get this a lot about the LEED certification systems as well. So when you think of a LEED core and shell or a LEED new construction, these are old rating systems that LEED had previously, such as in the BRE has BREEAM Offices 2006. What we've done is we've consolidated all those older schemes into one. Basically the current scheme. So with LEED, if you have a new construction or core and shell from 2012, you'd be reporting that as LEED BD&C, which is LEED Building Design and Construction. The reason we moved away from having all of these schemes in that drop-down menu is that you can think with LEED new construction or core and shell, there are, I could say maybe up to 25 different variations of LEED core and shell or LEED O&M. Let's, for example, V4, we had the V4 ACP, the performance pilot. So we really just consolidated this into one list. So BREEAM Offices 2006, that would, I'm assuming, likely be BREEAM new construction. But if you have specific questions about which certification and where to route that, please let us know and we'll make sure that that is covered. Charles, I see that you have another one marked that you'd like to answer live. So about the outlier thresholds.
Sure. Again, I took the liberty to assign that one to myself because it's very related to what we talked about earlier in the outlier model. So just to clarify on the change in the outlier model not impact the PI scoring. I would like to remind the fact that our outlier detection model contains two types of outliers. There is a soft outlier, which are ranging from 20 plus or minus 20%, between 20 and 30% of consumption change. And we have the hard outlier thresholds, which are actually 1,000 times those thresholds, which are in very, very few cases actually exceeded. So it means that the very reason of these outliers, the soft outliers, are simply to flag potential reporting errors to participants. They're not determining what is included in the benchmark or not. So whether you are exceeding those soft outliers or not, you will still be having those values included in your submission. But so the core reason for implementing those values is to make sure that you review and you agree with these consumption profiles. Which means that loosening soft outlier thresholds post-submission, the only impact that it's going to have, it would have had, essentially, is, let's say we would loosen the threshold, the soft threshold outliers from minus 30% to minus 50% to kind of accept all the all the values ranging from minus 30% to minus 50% to be included in the benchmark. The only impact that it would have means that these values would have not been flagged as outliers in the first place, but they would have, but they had been, since we hadn't changed them during reporting period. So it's a little bit complex to understand at first, because there's two levels at which we apply the outlier model. But if that's not clear, I would be happy to explain that offline. By maybe giving an example, but for that we would obviously need the name of the person. So if I think it is a question from someone anonymous right now, but if you're okay to share your name, I'd be happy to provide you an example offline.
Perfect, thank you, Charles. The next question, Max, I see that you're queued up for this one, and this was, I think, maybe the same user submitted this in advance. And this is regarding the waste audit requirements that we have for GRESB and possibly how often.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, a waste stream audit is actually a physical evaluation of the materials in your current building's waste streams, and then assessing whether these materials are actually currently disposed in the correct way. And therefore, like, your teams or like an auditor can actually have a quantification of these materials in your current waste streams, sort them up into like different categories, and by doing so, building managers just are actually able to potentially discover new disposal routes, or actually opportunities to divert more waste from landfill over to recycling and composting. And as a part, like waste stream audit is part of our efficiency measures under RA5 in this case for waste. And we actually asked if efficiency measures were implemented in the last 3 years of our assessment.
Perfect. Yeah. So that answers basically the how often is within our assessment. We asked for within the RA5 waste efficiency measures. There's a waste audit that you can check. That's every 3 years. But of course, probably best practice is doing this on an annual basis or biannual basis, just to make sure that you are quantifying your waste in the same right ways and making sure that it's being disposed of with the proper routes. I think with that, we can go to another question that was submitted, through the in advance. So this question is, how does GRESB recognize the emissions generated and resources used in the ground up development process? New concrete accounts for 8% of global CO2 emissions. How do we recognize this, and do we reward infill real estate locations for proximity to population densities and related lower vehicle miles? So Max, do you want to take this one?
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Kevin. In our current assessment, we actually do not capture the actual emissions from development. However, in indicator DMA 2.1, which is on the materials aspect of the development component, we ask for the life cycle assessment of emissions and whether these were actually performed on your development projects. On the second part about the urban infill, we then have in indicator DRE2 under the ESG requirements of the development component, we have certain issues that are actually in line with infill. For example, one issue is like whether in the site selection process you look at sites within already an developed area of a certain city or yeah.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And then, whether you're connected to multimodal transit networks, this is also something that we look at. But I think this is a great point on embodied carbon and how we, collect this information moving forward. Like Max mentioned, we have the embodied carbon lifecycle emissions assessment indicators that were introduced in the 2020 assessment. With the assessment stability, this is not something that was, really looked at this year, but it's definitely an area that we see of growing importance. You look at the fact on the slide, 8% of global CO2 comes from concrete. So we have to understand how much carbon is being used from really the beginning, so that we have full, cradle to gate, cradle to cradle, solid development projects. The next question, this was also submitted in advance, and I can take this one. So this is, how will Energy Star 2020 certifications be handled? Can we count the 2020 certifications awarded after January 1st towards the 2020 properties with energy ratings? So this was also something that was discussed with our governance groups, is should we allow extensions to certifications, basically in the case that you are awarded a certification after the close of the reporting period. If that certification is maybe relevant to performance from the reporting period, is that something we should look at? Overall feedback with this was that we should just continue to do as we have in the past, which is, has the asset been certified prior to the end of the year? In this specific case, Energy Star is allowing the performance period, basically you to apply for a certification that is, I think, outside of the 120 days where you would typically have to submit for the certification. But really looking at the 2020 calendar year, if your asset had an Energy Star certification from January 7th, 2020, that would still be valid, because what we're looking for is, was that certification, operational certification or design and construction certification, was that certification valid at any point during the reporting year? And if so, you can report it to GRESB. If there are specific questions about, follow-up questions about this, we'd be happy to do that through the GRESB contact form as well.
Kevin, can I interrupt 1 second and add a bit to it? As you mentioned, this point was discussed at length with our governance groups back in December 2020 and early 2021. And the very reason why there was such a wide array of different opinions on that topic was that, where on the one hand, you can argue that so long as an energy rating or any scheme really relates to a reporting period, it should be recognized in another framework that relates to the same reporting period. That is actually the very reason why this point was discussed in the first place. Now, what we did collect as main key feedback from the groups was that this would be creating discrepancies between the GRESB reporting requirements and other quality standards applied, for example, by third-party auditors, for example, non-financial auditors that would certify or assure non-financial information, which is an increasing trend that actually start covering the GRESB reports themselves, the GRESB assessment themselves. So given that third-party auditors actually look at the date of the certification as the eligibility criteria to report and to recognize a certification as valid as part of a reporting framework, the decision from those discussions was to keep investigating further with those parties this time, so not with the governance groups anymore, but with those third-party reviewers, to really understand what is the rationale behind recognizing the date of the certification itself or the scheme itself as the key date to base our judgment on, rather than the reporting, the year to which that scheme relates to. So that's still on the table right now, and it's still on the agenda on the GRESB side for further iteration of the assessment. So it doesn't mean that it might not change in the future. But for now, the main conclusion was that we hadn't dug deeper enough into that topic to actually understand the ins and outs and potential consequences. Since we didn't want to change the reporting requirements this year at the risk of changing them again next year with more information, the decision was to keep the assessment unchanged this year.
Yeah, Charles, thanks for that. I think that's really helpful context for everyone as well. Okay, I think we can turn to a couple of the questions submitted in the chat box. So I see Christina, the question from Dagmar. So I'll read this. How do we handle properties where energy and waste is controlled partly by tenants and partly by us? Or if certain energy is tenants controlled, but not water and waste?
Thank you, Kevin. So I think the answer to that question would really depend on the granularity of the data that is available at the asset level. So if the data is only available for the full building, all of this information will have to be reported as landlord controlled. We define landlord controlled whole buildings as a building where the data cannot be broken down and the landlord has any input or any type of operational control anywhere within the building, whereas commonly FRI leases or FRI leases or triple net leases are examples of something that is reported as whole building tenant controlled. So then if the information is not available at this level, but is available at the individual types of spaces within the asset, then the asset spreadsheet and the asset portal accounts for having some of the data, or depending on the space and the operational control within the space, the tenant spaces can be reported as either tenant or landlord controlled, as well as the base building data can be reported separately. If within energy, there are different types of utilities, some of which are controlled by the landlord and some of which are controlled by the tenant, then these spaces would again be defined as landlord controlled spaces, because within a given space, if the landlord has any type of operational control, then this is where the weight is being carried over. Team, did I miss something here?
No.
Is there something that you maybe want to add?
Yeah, I think a good follow-up to this is we do have a data dictionary and an instructions tab in the asset spreadsheet that are very, very descriptive on really where you should be allocating various tenant controlled versus landlord controlled data and how we define that. So that would be a good resource for the person that asked this question to review as well. Yes,
and also the training videos, there is a specific one dedicated on that topic as well.
Perfect. I think this is a good, this question is a good one to ask. This was actually from this morning's session. So if the asset is not operating for the full reporting year due to COVID, is it required to report on the performance component? And if yes, do you only need to report on those operating months? So I can start with the response to this one. So yes, what GRESB requires is that all assets that were owned by the entity, regardless of whether they were operational or not, is to be reported to GRESB. When I say operational, I mean maybe let's say not operational due to COVID-19, this would still need to be reported to GRESB. In the end, there's likely still some type of consumption coming from this asset. And as the entity does, own that asset, we would expect it to be reported for the performance component. We also do perform a check to ensure, it's called the reporting boundaries review process. And this is a selection of about 50 entities where GRESB basically validates and ensures that the report, the entire portfolio is being reported. Because the last thing that we want in our investors, trust us for this, is that when you're reporting a portfolio to GRESB, it is fully encompassing of the entire portfolio. It's not reporting your 50% best performing assets. So from an investor perspective, it's critical that what the metrics that they are seeing are relevant to the full investable vehicle that they have invested in. So yes, in the end, even if an asset was out of operation for 6 months, you would just report that of course you've owned the asset, let's say for the full 12, and you report the associated consumption from that time period.
Can I add just one more thing here? Mm-hmm. Do keep in mind that we also collect the vacancy rate at the asset level for all operational assets, and this vacancy rate can be, can reflect the actual vacancy rate, not necessarily the financial vacancy rate. So if your vacancy rate happens to be varying through the year due to COVID, you can also provide, and that's actually in the guidance, you can calculate the time-weighted vacancy rate, so the time-weighted actual vacancy rate of that assets, and report it to GRESB. That would feed into the outlier detection model to make sure that your values are deemed not outlying values. But again, it doesn't mean that those values are wrong. It means that they're flagged to you for review purposes.
Great. And then I think this next question builds quite nicely on the one we just answered is, will the temporary shutdown for a significant period be considered a reasonable explanation for lower use of resources if if it's flagged as an outlier. Christina, maybe do you want to touch on this one for a minute?
Yes, of course. I think that this was also something that Charles mentioned. Essentially, the purpose of the outlier model is to warn participants of any potential reporting errors. So then anything else, which is a reason for a value to actually have occurred, regardless of whether it is an outlier or not, is a realistic reason. So then very much so, having assets not be as operational or not at full capacity, which has led to a lower consumption during 2020 and 2021, is very much a reasonable explanation for an outlier at the asset level.
Great, thank you for that. I think we'll turn back to the Q&A, some of the ones submitted. So Max, the question around, since the asset level spreadsheet covers the years both 2019 and 2020, are assets which are under development only in 2019, but are standing investments in all of 2020 considered as standing investments or development for evaluation purposes?
Yes, the answer to this question depends on the chosen reporting period. Meaning when you choose the calendar year as a reporting period for the 2021 assessment, then as the asset is actually a standing investment for the entirety of 2020, it should be classified as a standing investment. However, if you report on the fiscal year, you have also the option to have like a fiscal year, for example, from July 2019 to June 2020. And therefore, when the building was still under construction in 2019, you should actually classify it as a standing as a development project in our assessment, as it was under construction still at any point during the reporting period that you actually chose.
Perfect. Yeah. So it does come down to the fiscal year versus calendar year reporting. But in the most general sense, if you are reporting on calendar year, which is a pretty large majority of our participants, it would only be covered once the project is completed. Then that's when it goes to the performance component. And if it was operational for the full 12 months of 2020, it would be only considered an operational asset.
Just to add one more thing to that answer, the reason why we're also requiring the last year data to be reported, and that's actually why we carried over from the previously reported submissions, is that we do score the like-for-like change, or we do score the consumption and emission changes over time. Now, one of the conditions for the like-for-like change of an asset to kick in and to be eligible for scoring purposes is actually to be the asset needs to be operational for 24 months in a row. In that case, if I understand correctly the question, that asset was only operational for 12 months because the 12 previous months was under development, which means that asset will not qualify for the like-for-like change, meaning that in the context of this year's reporting, it will be only seen as operational assets, disqualifying for the like-for-like change scoring.
Great, that's very helpful. I see a question about the necessity to report for properties sold during 2020. So this is also something that we do require. So all assets that are sold within the reporting period are to be reported to GRESB. Again, this is something that falls within our requirements of 100% of assets that were owned at any point during the reporting period must be reported to GRESB.
I think the logic that we could apply for that one is this asset has been owned by the GRESB assess the ESG performance of real estate companies during a reporting year. That asset was owned by the entity during the reporting year. So why would you even think about excluding an asset? Would you exclude an asset from your profit and loss statement? You wouldn't. So it is not a forward-looking tool. It is a backward-looking tool. And from that perspective, any asset that touched the balance sheet of or was owned by the reporting by a reporting entity at any point in time during the year have to be reported because it contributes to the overall energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. There was a good question, Kevin, that I thought would be nice to answer now. A question from Marta. When would you suggest to a new REIT with old assets to start the evaluation process? So I'm not really sure whether the question is about the REIT being new or the asset being old, but maybe I can try with the new REIT because I guess it's a newly set up REIT, so we're not really wondering when you should start reporting to GRESB. And I guess as a kind of a less advanced participants, one of the key benefits you can get by reporting ASAP really is to actually better get some good insight as to what the best practices are in your peer group, right? So you would report to GRESB, you would probably not be overperforming your peers since you're first year participants. However, in exchange, you do get some sort of insight as to how your peers, and when I say peers here, I mean the same type of properties in the same region, do behave on a yearly basis. And a lot of less advanced participants use that information that as a feed into their roadmap, their strategic roadmap going forward. And they see when the main trends are. That allows them to raise the bar and to put a target year on year and to really drive the needle forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Charles. I really like this next question that's submitted, and that question is, if it's our first year reporting to GRESB, do we have to report on the last 2 years of performance, so both 2019 and 2020? Christina, is this something you'd like to take?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. So this would depend on whether the participant would like to be accessible for the like-for-like change portion of the scoring or not. I would say. So if the data is available for 2 years past, then it is always recommended to include it, because this would also allow us to be able to score the performance also in terms of how the performance has changed over time through that portion of the score that we allocate to like-for-like change. So ideally, yes.
Yeah, exactly. If you have the data, it's of course best to report that, because if you're not reporting the 2 years, like Christina mentioned, there is points associated to like-for-like improvement year over year that would not be achievable without the previous year's data. There's another question that I can answer this one, and it's, our buildings were completed 2 years ago, so basically new construction projects. Many of the efficiency measures are integrated right from the beginning. Do we answer the drop down with true or false? So in the case of new development projects, we, of course, many of the efficiency measures are achieved just inherently due to the asset being brand new. So we do allow in this case for entities to select true for having implemented those efficiency measures, because indeed the asset is brand new, and if it has the specific efficiency measure as part of the new construction process, yes, that can achieve a positive response. Charles, I see one that you'd like to answer. So will our peer groups consist of managers who have the same reporting year, fiscal or calendar?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kevin. So the answer is no. We're not, when determining peer groups, we're not looking at the reporting year calendar versus fiscal. The main criteria when determining peer groups are geographies, sectors, strategies, and then percentage of indirectly managed or tenant controlled buildings, I should say. I kind of use the old terminology here. So we do not lump together fiscal year and calendar year with calendar years.
Great. So we've only got 2 minutes left, but there is one more question that I think we can answer. And that's kind of related to the dispositions we were just talking about. So if you sell a property in January 2020 and do not have influence and information on energy consumption for the remaining 11 months of the year, what are the implications of that? So in this case, what we're doing is we look at ownership period for the time for which you would have the data. So in this case, if you sold it in January 2020 and you had the previous year's data as well as that 1 month, and you had data for those 13 months, for all utility types, et cetera, you would have still 100% data coverage for that asset. So we're not expecting you to report data after. And this is also, I think, maybe good to bring up in the case of an acquisition. It also can benefit in certain situations to have the performance data from holding the asset. It'd be beneficial to have some of the performance data from prior to acquiring the asset, This can, of course, there's no penalty for not having that data. I mean, you didn't own the asset, but it can influence good behavior to have engagement with the seller to achieve some of that information. I see one more, Charles, that you've said that we can answer live. So I'll let you do that and then we can wrap up.
Sure, thanks. I think this is going to be the last question indeed. So Helen, you had a really good question here, which I think could be really relevant for a lot of participants here. How does GRESB account for different management approaches in lease structures? For example, we do not provide any waste management services on their behalf, on behalf of the tenants. This is one of the key characteristics of GRESB. Actually, when you will report your performance data at the asset level, you will first need to define each asset as either tenant controlled or landlord controlled. Some assets have a part of them being landlord controlled, some of the parts being tenant controlled. So you can actually answer either at whole building level, where the whole building is either tenant or landlord controlled, or you can report what we call on base building plus tenant space, where you can have a mix of both together, constituting one asset. Since we're differentiating those flow area types per control type, the very reason why we do so is actually to subsequently benchmark performance metrics in different benchmarking buckets. So we will be benchmarking together the same areas subject to the same control type of the landlord or of the tenants separately, to be determining what the score will be attributed to each area of an asset. So to answer your question, how does GRESB account for different management approaches? Well, the way we do account for these different management approaches is by differentiating those areas in the first place and benchmarking them together, and then re-aggregating them together to provide you with aggregated metrics at the asset level and portfolio level.
Perfect. And with that, I think we can wrap up. So I see that there's a few questions that are, we were not able to answer, live on the call, and we'll be sure to follow up to those in the case that we do have the name associated with that, and we also have the email. But in the case of an anonymous question, please use the gresb.com/contact form. And again, thank you everyone for joining. We had a bunch of questions answered to us, and I think we had a pretty dynamic call with everyone from the team contributing. So with that, I will leave everyone to the rest of their day. Have a nice evening for our European attendees, and have a great rest of your workday for our North American and South American participants. Thanks so much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.